A year ago, the then Minister of Health and Social Care, MHK Kate Beecroft, came out with the startling information that the number of drug-related deaths in the Isle of Man was significantly higher than the rate for England. And recently, the Manx charity Motivate published its findings of a study on the understanding alcohol and substance misuse in the older people on the island. Findings that revealed the extent of a significant and alarming problem in our society, and that amongst other issues we may be facing an epidemic of alcohol-related harm to older people. Motivate handles a whole variety of things, and today we're going to explore the report and to investigate and explain addiction in the Isle of Man and learn a little about Motivate. All three of our guests are from the addiction charity Motivate, and they are the director, Thea Ozenturk, and deputy directors Mylchreest and Lyndsey Smart. Well, ladies, thank you all for giving up your Sunday morning to join us. Maybe I could go to you first, Thea, and just tell me, would you please, what is Motivate? What's it set up to do?
Motivate is a Manx registered charity, and as you said, this year we celebrate our 40th anniversary of operation. Now, we're an old charity with a kind of new name. A lot of people may remember us as the Alcohol Advisory Service, and before that, we were the Isle of Man Council on Alcoholism. And the charity first came to being in 1977 when a group of concerned people locally, worrying about the misuse of alcohol in the island, decided to get together and they held a symposium. And they invited the Merseyside Council on Alcoholism to come to the island to help organise that event. And from that, a steering group was formed, and then the following year, probably with the help of Dr. Guy Panton, who was the consultant pathologist at Nobles Hospital, he was probably one of the key protagonists in the early days, they were able to set up a charity. The very first chair of the charity was the bishop of the time, the Honourable Vernon Nichols, another Manx worthy, and the Reverend Patterson Fraser was the first president of the charity. And so Dr. Guy Panton went on to become the president of the charity as well. So Motivate has got a long history, and it wasn't always called Motivate. And we're called Motivate now because we encompass other addictive behaviours. We're not just about alcohol. We are a service that helps people with drug problems, with gambling issues. We are exploring other addictive behaviours as well, for example, technological addictions like gaming. And I think that's why we've survived as a charity. You know, lots of charities like ours throughout the United Kingdom have gone by the wayside. And we have survived, I think, because we have looked at our local community, we've looked at emerging need, and we've responded. And I think it's also to do with how we treat our clients when they come to see us. We're very confidential. We're non-judgmental. People, the girls will agree with me here, people are always very surprised about the fact that Motivate doesn't have a waiting room. Mm-hmm. So when somebody comes to see us for the first time, they're directed straight to a counselling room. They're offered a hot cup of tea or coffee. It's about making that person feel at ease. And we so need a service like that in the heart of the town. Because people are very self-conscious. The stigma and the embarrassment, particularly in a small community, stops people from coming forward for help.
Yes, well, Lyndsey, how do people come to you? Are they referred by anybody, or do they just say, I better go and walk through the door?
The majority of our referrals are actually self-referrals. Mm-hmm. So people can, it's very easy access. They can pick up the phone, they can send us an email, and they can make an appointment for themselves. But we also do accept referrals from other agencies, so whether that be the doctor or whether that be other professional services, the key thing for us is access. So it's not just about receiving referrals from other agencies, it's giving the people the option to actually make that referral for themselves as well.
Yes, I do get referrals from places like the courts.
And we do have a criminal justice intervention scheme. So we have various schemes where people will get involved with us in that way. However, our service is voluntary. So whilst we do have people involved with the courts, there still has to be a voluntary basis that they want to work with us as well.
Right, so how do you fund it? Because it sounds as if it's quite a wide operation now.
Motivate is funded primarily via a contract with the Isle of Man Mental Health Services, part of the Department of Health and Social Care. But now, obviously, we're in austere times. Funding is being squeezed in all departments. And so we are finding now that more and more of our funding is coming from other sources. So we've become quite adept at putting together business cases, applying to trusts like the Manx Lottery Trust. They've been extremely helpful to us. They've funded quite a few of our projects. At the moment, they fund our family alcohol service, which is a service that works with children and parents who are impacted by alcohol misuse. They're funding our group work programme. We have a group running 4 days a week now in Motivate in our purpose-built recovery hub, which is a separate suite. They also funded the older persons research project as well. So that's a lot of our funding is coming from other sources, which is good.
I think we'll go quite clearly onto that research project shortly, because it's your latest and it's quite a detailed one at that.
Yes.
But as far as that is concerned, that's a specific section of older people. But in your, I suppose I could put it this way, okay, in your normal business, what do you deal with most? Is it drugs? Is it alcohol or something else?
It always used to be alcohol, but then as Thea said, as we've developed over the years and different trends have evolved, we've now gone into the drugs arena as well as gambling and gaming as well. But at the moment, the majority of the clients still are alcohol related.
Right. Well, that takes us, because you actually say in your title, an addiction service.
Yeah.
So how would you, Kate, describe an addiction? What is it?
So an addiction is any behaviour for somebody, whether it be psychological or whether it be physical as well, a dependence that for people generally builds up over time, but it's something that continues even though that person begins to develop sort of problems and negative consequences from it.
So it's really a condition by the sound of it, is abnormal, or somebody being abnormal dependent on some particular habit then, in that instance.
That's exactly how it can start for people. It can start as something as small as a habit, but then they grow to depend on it over time, absolutely, and that's how it can build up.
Do you have any figures of how many people within our society are addicted to something?
Well, the Director of Public Health published her first report last year, and she estimated that about 13,500 people on the Isle of Man had a reliance on alcohol, whether that be in a severe capacity or at risk of developing. So that's a significant number if you look at our population level. I think also she estimated that 4,000 people had used illicit substances, mostly cannabis, and also that 1 in 5 families on the island were impacted by somebody else's substance misuse.
But an addiction, so people eat too many crisps, or I'm not going to these simple and silly level almost now, but this is almost part of human nature, isn't it?
I think it probably is. I mean, I think if we went back to the caveman days, aren't there some drawings somewhere in a cave of the caveman getting a bit drunk on the fruit that they'd stored for the winter? You know, it is. It's as old as time. Human consciousness is to try and escape sometimes from your reality, and I think that's how it is.
It can start as a pleasure-seeking behaviour.
Yeah.
So what causes an addiction then? I mean, you see people who've come into you and they're either hooked on drugs or they can't stop drinking. Well, but they had to start somewhere.
Yeah, there's a variety of reasons. One of the things we'll often look at is it can look like it's a maladaptive coping mechanism. So quite often, as Thea was just saying there about people looking for escape, what they can look around them is how they cope in certain situations, and then actually the level and the proportion that it becomes at starts to become their priority. So it kind of morphs from a coping mechanism into something else. But everybody is completely different. You know, we very much work with people in terms of their individualism, because everybody's addiction will be different as well.
But you say it changes into something else. So it starts for one reason, it ends up as another one.
It can do, yeah, and that's not for everybody, but it can do, yeah. You know, I think quite often we can have things in our lives that actually have been at a level, whether that be drugs, alcohol or whatever, you know, and people don't feel it's a problem, and then it can escalate. And I think that's why everybody has their own definition for what an addiction is.
I've heard it said that alcohol problems in particular is a form of self-medication.
Yes, for some it is, absolutely.
Nobody sets out to have an addiction.
No.
You know, they're using a substance or getting involved in a behaviour because it starts off as enjoyment, but for some people it's actually relief. When we did our research, the pathways to addiction, we looked at the life stories of 50 people on the island who had an addictive behaviour, And for lots of them, they cited so many reasons why
Yeah.
they had ended up in this position. And often there were instances of the neglect in childhood, abuse,
Trauma.
bereavement, loss, trauma. So there are significant reasons. It's not always about pleasure.
Escape mechanism.
Yes.
Can be very complex.
Well, if you now have got somebody in your family and you wonder about them, whether perhaps something's not quite right, what do you need to look for? What are the critical signs of an addiction?
Okay. If they're spending too much time, you know, the thing about alcohol is it's not, you can't hide it, can you? If somebody in your family has an alcohol problem, it's very visible.
You smell
can
it.
see. You can smell it for a starter. Their behaviour. Yeah. It's an intoxicant. You know, it's a depressive drug, so that person will be acting in a way that it's hard to miss. Now they may say, oh, it won't happen again, you know, if they're missing work, if they're spending too much money on it, if they're absent from the home, or you're finding bottles, etc. You know, that's very visible. So those are things that people would look out for. And if that behaviour pattern continues, things like gambling, Lyndsey will explain. She has a beautiful way of explaining how it is.
Yeah, gambling is difficult because quite often when we work with families, it's more the lack of trust and the breakdown in the communication that they find difficult, because quite often it's very secretive. It's certainly with gambling, when a lot of people are gambling, they're not as open, it's not as obvious, there's not as many physical indicators that somebody is kind of taking part in that sort of behaviour. And then quite often when people do come forward, we can quite often be the last resort when people have accepted that gambling's not going to get them out of the problem. So at that point, family members find out about it, and there's quite often quite difficult financial issues that have happened because someone's tried to gamble their way out of the problem. So for family members there, it's really hard because not only did they not know about the addiction, when they find out, the implications on them, the consequences for them as a family are enormous.
Well, I was going to really go to drugs or drink first, but seeing you've introduced gambling, maybe we should stick with it just for the time being. So how would you know, somebody in the family, how would they know there's a gambling problem?
It's a difficult one to actually put into a kind of a succinct sentence, but again, it's very similar to the recognising the signs of other addictions. So is somebody saying they're working late, for instance, but there's no sign of any extra wages? Or is there secretive behaviour that's going on? Is there money going missing and you're not sure where? Is somebody spending more of their time going to places such as the pub, and it turns out they're playing on fruit machines, or to the bookmakers or things like that? So there's lots of different signs. When we look at online gambling, is someone spending more time on the computer, so they're spending increased amounts of money and increased amounts of time in the home on that. I think with online gambling, it's made gambling far more accessible. So you don't have to go out of the house anymore to do it. And certainly with smartphones, I think there's not many people in the world that don't have one. So it's literally at the touch of a button that you can gamble.
This must have, all of these addictions must have, but this one must particularly have an impact on the relationship with the family, even the friends.
I think they all do, actually. And actually, I think the hardest part for family members can often be that they recognise there's a problem and they recognise the impact, sometimes before the person with the addiction themselves does. So that's why we offer support for family members, even if we never meet the person with the addiction, because sometimes they need somewhere to go to actually say, this is happening in our family, this is impacting on us, we don't know what to do about it, we need somebody to talk to. And quite often family members will come with the idea of how can we make that person change, and instead we have to say, okay, well actually that person is the one that can make a change. How can we support you in helping you with this situation and coping with the life that's happening for you right now?
Maybe we'll come back to it in a minute, but I always understood, for instance, someone with an alcohol problem, in order to get some effect, if not a cure, they had to want it themselves. You can't make them do it.
Yeah, I mean, we do you hear of people having interventions, but essentially until you want to do something, we can all relate to that, until you feel you want to do something, it's not necessarily going to be that easy. But also with a lot of people, they don't have the confidence or the self-esteem to believe they can make that change. So sometimes agreeing to come to the service, even if you're not sure if you want to do it or you can do it, can still make a difference, because we can help that person recognise that they are able to.
But they've got to be prepared to come to you.
Yeah, I mean, we're very accessible, and we will work with clients on an individual basis to make it as easy as possible for them to attend.
I'm sure that is the case. What I'm trying to get at is they're the person who has to make the decision to walk through your door.
We do, yeah. I mean, we do have people that try to make appointments for people on someone else's behalf, but they have to want to do it. It's not all about, that's why we're voluntary. You know, it's if you send somebody somewhere, they're not going to do it unless they feel like they want to.
I just say we're very used to people walking through our doors who really don't want to be there.
Yeah.
And that's the skill of the work.
Yes.
Is how we can raise in their consciousness a conflict about their behaviour and maybe where they'd like to be in life. And that's the skill of the workers that we have at the team, is
definitely.
that you know, we do work with individuals who don't really want to be there, but somehow that we can start to sort of pick away at that, unpick it, and start to make them think about possibly that change would be a good thing for them.
Yeah, see, it's a possibility.
You can,
So once having,
no, I was just going to say, you can learn to sort of work with that resistance.
Yes.
once they've accepted the fact that there's some need and they've started, you talked about support, because it must be rather difficult. I mean, I've seen people trying to give up cigarettes, for instance, and it's not an easy task for some people. I presume these other addictions are equally difficult to give up.
Well, of course they can be, but you know, we know that people can and do, and that's why we work in this line of work. So by helping support people through that process, through the counselling and the interventions that we provide, you know, from the one-to-one sessions to the group work, to our Smart Recovery programme, which is peer-led support as well. You know, we can provide a holistic approach to people to enable them to start making those changes.
A significant part of the Isle of Man economy these days relies on the profits from online gambling. I mean, it's available and readily available. Do you think people themselves are protected from themselves enough, Lyndsey? I mean, are our mechanisms sufficient enough to make sure that the vulnerable don't get too hooked?
I mean, the options are there. I mean, I always refer to it with clients as it's either a sprint or it's a hurdle. So the more hurdles you can put in place, the less likely you are to get to the finish line, which is, let's say, that's gambling. So there are ways of banning yourself online. There are ways of putting a block on your computer. You can self-exclude from places like the casino and the bookmakers. You can put financial restraints on your bank accounts or with support from family members. All of these options, all of these hurdles are there, but that you can put in place. But like we said, if somebody wants to get to the end of there and gamble, then they can. So there's only so much that community and individuals and societies can do, and if that person is the one that has the responsibility to actually achieve that, but we are there to support them in doing that and help them put as many hurdles in place as possible to try and help them reach their own goals.
What about alcohol? And let's move on to the issues of alcohol in our society. I can clearly recall on these programmes various chief constables saying during the course of the programme, well, the largest portion of crime in the Isle of Man is drink-related, alcohol-related. Would you think that still is the same today?
It probably is. I mean, when you look at the older person's report, particularly in the older age bracket, surprisingly, they had quite a higher rate of offending. It's quite surprising, really. Motivate has schemes whereby we work in the criminal justice system. We've got a scheme called the AIR scheme that we run with the police alcohol unit, so that first-time offenders can be offered sort of an education opportunity to look at their drinking intervention, and that's been really, really successful. The outcomes of that have been really successful. So yeah, it still is a huge aspect though, isn't it? I mean, there's been recently on the news, the licensed victuallers were talking about it, weren't they, about incidences in pubs.
That's people tanking up before they reach the pub.
Possibly, yeah. I mean, preloading. This is where, you know, minimum unit price perhaps would be a helpful introduction.
Scotland's done that. Do you think it would work?
Yes, in a nutshell.
It just wouldn't make people who are determined to drink spend more.
Well, they would, but then ultimately your purse for the majority of folk would run out, wouldn't it? You know, that's targeting the booze that problem drinkers like mostly. You can, in Scotland, they determined that you could drink your week's worth of units, 14 units, for £2.50 with one of those strong ciders. Now, under these new guidelines, that cider increases up to become a connoisseur's drink at £7.50. So if you've got more, you know, alcohol is now more affordable than it's ever been, you know, for the average person. So they have to do something, and the evidence suggests that really does work in the countries that have introduced it.
Right, but the idea of number of people who drink, well, a lot of people have something to drink, but it doesn't mean to say they're an alcoholic or they have a drink problem.
No, and it won't impact on them.
No,
because all pubs mostly, you know, alcohol is way above minimum price anyway, isn't it? It's the cheap supermarket alcoholic drinks that problem drinkers tend to target because of their pure volume of alcohol. Those are, and actually it will be a huge benefit to society because you'll have less people in hospital, blocking beds. The police won't be dealing with it as much. So that's going to have a knock-on effect for the rest of society. So when we need a hospital bed for, we've had an accident or something, we would have it. It wouldn't be as dramatic.
But I see, look, before they came here today, I've been looking through all sorts of statistics, get quite confused with some of them because there's so many of them.
Yeah.
Yes. But 26% people consume in a way that is harmful, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, and again, it's harmful is that word where it causes a negative consequence if something happens. I think sometimes we can have quite a high tolerance for what okay drinking is. So I think it's when we look at statistics, it's just about making sure that we're aware of what's out there, and it also raises an awareness with the community. So when someone hears a statistic like that, you would like to think they'd go, am I in that category? Is that me? Is that something that perhaps I need to think about?
Is there a need perhaps that we not just look at stopping people from drinking, but research a great deal more into actually why they drink?
Yeah, and that's exactly what we do with our service. This is looking at the root causes of why it's in their life. We're not an abstinence-based service, so we look at harm reduction. We look at what the client, whether they want to reduce or whether they want to stop. So this is about looking at where the addiction came from and helping them look at that root cause, looking at the behaviours, looking at their emotions and changing potentially the way they think about things in conjunction with addressing the addiction. Doing it in isolation is not necessarily going to achieve the required outcomes for them.
Well, okay, I've known people with ADHD or ADD as they get into adulthood, and that is actually the reason why they drink. It's this self-medication again.
Yeah, there can be lots of, like we've talked about, there can be lots of reasons why people sort of fall into using alcohol or drugs to self-medicate, whether that be from sort of a younger age or into adulthood. Sometimes people with other mental health problems, from depression to anxiety, will also turn to alcohol rather than their prescription medication because they feel that that's what works for them.
How do you know if you've got a drink problem? How would you recognise it? Because I seem to find that a lot of people who indeed do have a problem are in denial about it. So how do you know if you have a drink problem and identify it? Personally, do you identify it?
The very basic benchmark is it's costing you more than money. If it's causing you to
Really
have
good way to put it.
health problems, if it's upsetting your family, it's damaging your relationships, if it's impacting on your work, if that substance is doing those things to you, whether it's alcohol, drugs or anything else, then you're likely to start, you've probably got a problem with it.
But you have to recognise it.
Yes.
Yes. Well, there are recently published new government guidelines for safe drinking. Is there such a thing as safe drinking?
I think they call it low-risk drinking.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's not safe. No. I think they're very clear.
The guidelines have said there is no level of safe drinking now.
Yeah.
There is just this low level risk.
And that's because now the research is just so proven that alcohol, is damaging to health.
Yeah.
There are over, 60 medical conditions related to alcohol misuse. I mean, when you're looking at, you said before that statistic about a quarter of the population problems with alcohol. We're talking about it's impacting on perhaps their cholesterol levels. It's damaging their liver, it's impacting on their brain. So there's so many parts of the body, it's related to several cancers. There's so many parts of the body that are impacted.
Right, well, so there's a whole variety of things from this. So let's go back perhaps to the service that you provide. How effective do you think that you are? I keep saying this because I'm very well aware that drink probably is one of the most difficult ones in some respects with people. When they come to see you, are you able to say, right, that worked?
I mean, obviously, it depends on the client. It depends on what they've wanted to achieve, and if they've got somewhere, then that's great. I mean, we have in our report, you'll see in terms of how the change. I think it's 87% had a positive treatment outcome. So we take scores as we go. We look at different areas of their life where they're at when they start in the service, and that can be from social, economic, financial, family relationships, any conflicts, their mental health, and then we track how that changes through their actual time with the service.
Now, you go back to a moment to Dr. Henrietta Hewitt when she was talking about unit pricing, which is what you were on about a minute ago, and the amount of cheap alcohol available, particularly in the supermarkets. But apart from that, there is still the secondary issue where it's not so cheap in pubs, and we get this violence that is going on. As you so rightly said, the pub landlords are really making a campaign against this at the moment. I suppose one could argue to agree there might be an architect of their own misfortune there.
Excuse me. There may be other factors to consider here, though. I think we really need to look at this. We know, dare I say it, but we know that there's quite prolific cocaine use. And when you mix cocaine with alcohol, it can impact on behaviour. It can make people quite angry. It produces a drug of its own.
Cocoethylene.
Cocoethylene in the body, which has been known to increase anger levels. So there may be many other factors going on here that perhaps we need to research why we've had this spike in violent behaviours in pubs. I mean, it could be to do with preloading as well. When people are drinking so much before they go out.
Or taking something else.
And maybe taking something else as well. So that's something maybe to factor in. I'm not saying that is actually the case, but I think we just need to research this and look at it holistically to see what's going on.
Just before we go off it, when you say help for the family, one immediately thinks perhaps of the wife or the partner who's suffering the wrong end, but the children too. Do children come and see you?
Yes, we have a family alcohol service. Now that was piloted in 2016. We received funding from the lottery at the end of 2016 after a successful pilot. Now, the family alcohol service primarily works with children and parents, and in an ideal situation we work with both, but it doesn't have to be the case. And it allows children to have a voice. It almost gives them permission to talk about what's happening in the family home, because it can be quite secretive for them. So we see them in a confidential way with them as well, and it's about reassuring them that they're able to talk about this. So we use play therapy skills, and a lot of their communication happens through play, in a warm environment for them, so that it's not worrying. A lot of the young people that we do see are quite anxious. They have quite low self-esteem. But the whole point of the family alcohol service is to start to break this intergenerational cycle of alcohol misuse. So children that grow up with parents who misuse alcohol are 4 times more likely to have an alcohol problem in adulthood themselves. So this is about breaking that cycle, giving them a voice, improving their communication and improving their support network as well.
Is the problem, particularly alcohol, is it seasonal? Do you get more at certain times of year, like Christmas?
Not really, no. Not when it comes to kind of problematic drinking for somebody who's kind of fallen into that. No, not really.
I asked the question because I noticed quite recently, that January this year it was, that in the United Kingdom there was a surge. The treatment centres braced for a New Year surge in demand, which happened.
New Year's resolutions.
There was.
I think there's probably a couple of spikes. I think probably February. I think sometimes when people maybe have made a resolution to try and change, and then perhaps it doesn't work for them, and then
like
they
most
might,
New Year resolutions.
Yeah, and then they might rock up sort of around that time. But really, the service has become so busy now. It's so hard to see if there are any trends in that way. We're at record-breaking numbers for our services, which is fantastic, really, but sad on the other side of it as well.
As far as we're talking about alcohol here, and we're talking about the various drinking habits, but there is another habit that's crept in, isn't there? And that is what I would call the business or social drinking. People who finish work and go off to the wine bar. And this tends to be more prevalent with young women who seem to be rather too fond of 2, 3, 4 bottles of wine. Well, I look at it anyway. Well, if a cap fits.
No, I think this is why, you quite often hear the phrase alcoholic that gets thrown down, and that we're trying to move away from this word alcoholic, because quite often people have a stereotype in their mind of what an alcoholic is, and instead we look at alcohol dependence. And that scenario that you've just described there is someone is dependent on living for the weekend and getting to that Friday and Saturday, but actually the level they drink on that Friday and Saturday is quite high, but they can't imagine getting through that time without it. Then that's a dependence. So that's why we try and move away from that word, but it is looking again at what we talked about in terms of what an addiction is, and is that causing a negative impact on their life or not, and is it costing more than just financial.
Well, we need to move on to a few other forms of addiction yet, including drugs and including your recent report. So maybe we should do that after the commercial break, which we'll take now. We'll be back in just about 3 minutes with more about the various addictions and what can be done about them. Back to Sunday Opinion, where we are now going to explore a little bit further with our studio guests, Thea Ozenturk, Kay Mylchreest and Lyndsey Smart from the charity Motivates, just more of the issues to do with the addiction that we've been talking about earlier on. Sometimes the press can be a little bit over-spectacular, but the European press seems to say that the UK is the drug overdose capital of Europe. Now, would you think that's a fair description?
I think it comes from the World Drug Report, doesn't it?
Yes.
Some of the statistics. I don't know. I think it's probably a Western Hemisphere. I mean, America has a huge drug crisis as well, so Western sort of cultural hemisphere type problems maybe, but not particularly to Great Britain.
Not to the great extent. Does any of this wash on to us because of the close proximity to the UK?
Probably, yes. I mean, the statistic you talked about earlier about drug-related deaths on the Isle of Man, since that figure was discovered, several projects have been implemented through the drug and alcohol team where they can, the service users, their family members have had training to initiate naloxone, which is an antagonist for opiate overdose. So that's had a great impact. That's hugely improved that. So it's an old stat, and it's quite, as you see, the media would perhaps pick up on that, but a lot has been done to counter that.
How's the drug dependency or the whole drug business, Lyndsey, has it changed much? Because I've always used to think of it to do with heroin or cannabis or something of this nature, and ecstasy.
Yeah.
But we've seen a whole lot of new products on the market now.
Well, drug use in young people has increased.
Yes.
In 2014, it stood at about 14-15%. In 2016, it was up to 21%. And young people's drinking has come down, because we often think about young people and alcohol, don't we? But actually, young people's drinking per se has come down. There are some at-risk groups that still drink excessively, but they're now turning to more new psychoactive substances.
Yeah. And it's
Cannabis, other drugs.
Yeah, it's accessibility as well, and it's what's socially acceptable. I think times are changing a little bit. I mean, the public health report said that 74% of young people had never actually had a drink. That shows you how it's changed. So it's very much about the times and society that we're in. I think that reflects what's happening.
You mentioned, I mentioned at the start, Kate Beecroft's comment about Manx drug death rate is worse than in England, but she says in that release that opiates are one of the major causes of it, and if I look, as you said, to America, for instance, this is a serious problem. Some states in America have got an enormous problem with it. People taking painkillers, people taking prescription drugs. I can't quite understand, and maybe you could explain it, how people can take a prescription drug that is so dangerous when they don't need it. How do they get hold of it?
Well, they may have been prescribed it in the first instance. And you've got to remember that some prescription drugs have got quite a significant drug in their makeup, narcotic makeup, so you have opiates that are prescribed. You've got diazepam, which is a benzodiazepine, which is Valium. All of these drugs have the ability to induce dependency if you take enough of them.
Well, I was looking at these American ones with names like fentanyl and pregabalin, if that's the way you pronounce it. Yeah. And apparently the new Valium that seems to be caused, if that's the way you call it, there does seem to be a considerable amount of the problem now is all these new drugs.
Yeah, pregabalin was actually first used to help people who suffered from epilepsy. Yeah. And people who also have anxiety issues, but it is one of those drugs that has very quickly become a problem because of the feelings of well-being, I suppose, that people can experience when they take it.
Yeah, it's on trend, for want of a better word, and actually young people are experimenting with pregabalin as well. So it is a concern.
Well, coming back to my first question, they can't all be being prescribed it?
No. I mean, have you heard of the dark web?
Wondered when that would come in.
The dark web, I think, probably is flourishing. It's a way that you can purchase drugs online and not leave a footprint, if you like. It's got a kind of a hidden search engine. and people will purchase online. People bring drugs back from abroad as well. So these drugs, prescription type drugs, the purity of them and whether or not they are safe to take is not guaranteed, but they will be sold online. You know, anyone can search and will find you buy Valium online, buy pregabalin online,
Yeah, and
buy sleeping tablets like Zopiclone online. Hope I'm not giving anyone any tips here. But sadly, it is a byproduct of modern technology and the way that people now, people now want to procure drugs by this manner, as opposed to your regular dealer.
Well, looking at, as you said, looking at the United States, which does seem to be where a lot of information you can come from. Oregon is battling a thing they call the rust disease. It's drugs coming in from all over the place. They've got to the point of having to deliver clean syringes to drug people and take the old ones away and destroy them.
Yeah.
In a way they can control. Do we do anything like that over here?
Oh yes.
Yeah, needle exchange
Needle
scheme.
exchange schemes,
In the chemists'
and the
pharmacy.
chemists will run that. So again, that's looking at harm reduction. That's actually looking at ways of making it safer, not safe, but safer for people that are going to inject, because there's an awful lot of blood-borne viruses that they can actually contract from sharing needles. So having these schemes actually says, this person isn't ready to change, doesn't want to change, so let's make it as safe as possible and make sure they have at least got clean needles, and looking at the ways in which they inject. Because unfortunately that's where there can be a lot of negative consequences if it's
well,
done different.
the Kentucky, I noticed, actually says that this is a poisoning epidemic, and they say that it comes in the post from China, which you think it'd be picked up, wouldn't you?
Yes.
If it was
China
coming from
is
the
one of
post.
the main countries that is.
It's interesting enough that Kentucky
producing.
also is the state Attorney General in Kentucky is suing the chemical company Johnson & Johnson. They say that they have a deceptive marketing scheme designed to flood the state with opioid-based prescription painkillers. So there does seem to be quite a strong awareness of
Prescription drugs have definitely, the use of prescription drugs or the misuse of prescription drugs has definitely increased.
Right. Well, it seems to be that all of the various things is the way of getting somebody off these drugs, different. For instance, if it's heroin or these particular drugs, is the actual problem, is the treatment different, is the reaction different?
The drug and alcohol team that we have on Ireland, they have what we would call treatment in terms of medication. So sometimes it's very dangerous to just stop an opiate. So quite often when they go to the drug and alcohol team, we would, if a client presented to us, for instance, and said, I'm on heroin and I want to come off it, we would make a referral to the drug and alcohol team so they can have some sort of substitute that's prescribed to them instead of injecting heroin. So it's more of a medical way of looking at it. And then also you would incorporate that with the behavioural aspect as well to look at the addiction. But primarily it's important to get the medication sorted so that they can actually ensure they can stop using heroin in a safe way.
Now, what seemed very surprising, I think a lot of people would think that drug is probably a younger person's issue, yet you've just produced a detailed report on understanding alcohol and substance misuse in older people in the Isle of Man, and quite clearly it would appear that there's quite a lot of it.
That's right. So the study came about on the back of findings from the UK and further afield, particularly in America and Australia, about in particularly sort of the baby boomer generation, who at a time of sort of greater drinking have aged but have gone on to sort of drink and potentially use drugs and carry on, but with sort of perhaps little awareness of the risks that the older person might be facing.
So are you saying that this is something which is carried on from their younger days and still running through? Quite
possibly, yes. That seems to be the case. That seems to be what the research is showing, yes.
And is there much evidence that this is causing a lot of harm in older people?
Yes, of course, because what sometimes we don't realise, I suppose, is that as we age, unfortunately there are physiological changes and biological changes that go on in the body, and perhaps people aren't quite as aware as if they continue to drink in the way that they have done, or use drugs or misuse prescription drugs or over-the-counter drugs, that their body just isn't able to deal with those in the way it would have done when they were younger, unfortunately.
What is it, though, that there's the problem with these? You talk about substance. Is it alcohol, drugs? Well, what is the most key substance?
It's all of those things. When we talk to the people and professionals on the island about what they were recognising and what they were seeing coming forward, alcohol was the main one, but also some of the prescription drugs, particularly zopiclone, some of the benzodiazepines, also concerns about some of the over-counter drugs as well, ranging from even sort of paracetamol to the cocodamol based as well.
Is this a matter of overprescribing?
Is it a matter of what, sorry?
Overprescribing.
Not necessarily. It's just about people misusing. You know, some participants talked about the fact that sometimes they would go into somebody's house and open their bathroom cabinet and they would find that they'd stockpiled, unfortunately, sort of their medications and things. So it's not necessarily about over-prescribing, but it's about, you know, not taking the medication in the way in that it has been prescribed, and also then using other substances over the counter as well, and using that on top of their prescription medication.
And a bit of alcohol.
And alcohol on top of that, yeah.
If you talk about older people, where do you draw the line? Where does older start?
Oh, that's very, very difficult, and we've debated that, and the people that we talked to debated that. When we started the study, we specifically wanted to look at the over 65s, and that's how we've tried to sort of define it. However, a lot of people that we talk to would also say that what happens as people drink and use substances is that they do age, so that somebody who is actually in their 50s may present as somebody much, much older, as in their 60s or 70s, because of the health problems that they're then having with those substances.
Premature aging.
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
So what's at most risk? Which section? Because I presume you're starting somewhere in the 50s by the sound of it. So which bit of the age spectrum is most at risk?
Well, when we looked at some of the research and the stats on the Isle of Man, there was an interesting one that came out from, I think it was the Isle of Man Social Attitudes Survey, and I think it was 43% of the 55 to 64-year-old males were drinking hazardously at that point. So it's certainly something that we need to be targeting, perhaps people in their 50s, before it then becomes, you know, too much of a problem as they age.
But there must be some issues, especially with older people, where perhaps they turn to alcohol. Again, is this self-medication as some means? Because I notice your report talks about homeless people, they talk about poor housing, you talk about a number of conditions which might, without trying to sound too much of a cliche, drive somebody to drink.
Yes, certainly there were some big issues that were uncovered. It's quite an eye-opener for us to hear some of the, you know, scenarios and situations that particularly some of the sort of the third sector groups were kind of encountering, excuse me, from homelessness to, you know, sort of poor nutrition, poor finances. But it's not just about that as well. You know, as we age, unfortunately, there are physical changes that happen, retirement, loss of purpose, bereavement, isolation. There's lots of other reasons why, as somebody grows older, that they might start to encounter those kind of problems, and that might lead them to use alcohol or other substances to try and cope with that.
Well, maybe we can cover a little bit more of this, because I gather all three of you have agreed to stay on for the Man in Line, which
That's right.
is good, excellent, at 1:15. So yes, that's fine, because there seems to be so many issues. I suppose most people listening to us today would be surprised to hear of the number of people who are older people who were caught in this particular loop, and also might be also surprised to hear about some of the social deprivation in what Malmsborg used to call our prosperous and caring society. Is this something that is particular in a particular group of people from some like area? Do they people who've been working in certain things? Is there any categories that you can define? Can you look and say that's likely to be a risk factor?
Oh, in terms of professions? Not really, no. I mean, it crosses all social strata.
Right. Across the board, is it?
Yeah, all ages, all professions, you know, from people who are perhaps, you know, more deprived to yeah.
Now, I must interrupt you there, but we've got to stop. We've been looking at various aspects of addiction in the Isle of Man. Now, our studio guests here are from Motivate are Thea Ozenturk, the charities director, together with deputy directors Mylchreest and Lyndsey Smart. And if you'd like to add your voice to this discussion, then join us all when we return for the Man in Line. That's Manx Radio's Sunday phone-in programme at 1:15 after the news, weather and sport. You can phone us on 66 13 68, text us on 166177 and email to studio at manxradio.com. Catherine Nichol was our producer. I'm Roger Watterson, and we all look forward to your company once more at 1:50.